Welcome to the Freeborn Podcast. Today is Friday afternoon, 3:27 p.m. I thought I would squeeze one of these in, talk a little bit about what we have coming up, as well as touch a little bit on some of the subjects that we've dealt with previously. Just kind of do a little bit of maybe housekeeping, if you want to call it that. As far as what we have coming up, tomorrow at 9 a.m., we're going to be live with our weekend podcast. And my guest is going to be Bill Kincaid. He's one of the elders at the church Gathering in Jesus' Name at 602 Oak Knoll. That is a church that I was a missionary sent out of for 25 years or something like that, 20-some years. He was a missionary for, I think, over 30 years, both in Guatemala and in Mexico. And he and I were arrested in Toluca, Mexico. Toluca, if you want to say it in Spanish, Toluca, Mexico, maybe 12 years ago. I've lost track. I'm going to say 12 to 14 years ago, something like that. We were arrested at our outdoor public air church meeting and deported a week later, he and I together. And so we were co-workers in Toluca. We have collaborated on a lot of projects, both spiritual and non-spiritual. We did a lot of programming together. We built a lot of stuff together. He and I are interested in a lot of the same things as far as mechanics and devices and lathes and mills and different things like that. And so we've been friends and shared interests for a very long time. Anyway, so he's my guest this Saturday at 9 a.m. And the main subject that I asked him to come on to talk about, which is, I know some people might not be interested in this, but I try to make podcasts across a broad range of subjects. And so, I realize not everyone's interested in every podcast I have or every guest that I have or every subject that we discuss. But the subject for this one is I wanted to talk with him about how exactly sin is a better explanation for lascivious human behavior, as opposed to biological evolution. So evolutionary biologists, they believe that the inherent goal, although all the words they use are problematic, because evolution is a natural process, unguided natural process, to which you can't technically ascribe human concepts. So you can't talk about the goal of evolution, the desire of evolution, the plan of evolution. None of those things exist because it's unguided. There is no God for an evolutionary biologist. A strict evolutionary biologist would say, and even if they aren't atheist, they would say that once we're in the realm of evolutionary biology, well, then there's no God guiding this. This is an unguided, purely natural selection process or mechanism. And so they use the words that, and this is, I think, one of the problems that many theists and Christians have with evolutionary biology, is that they describe it in terms that are very anthropomorphic, very human. So they talk about, evolution wants something. Evolution has a goal for something. Evolution is trying to do something. And you have to understand that when you're listening to evolutionary biologists talk about evolution, especially if they're not in the classroom, if they're not in an academic setting, if they're doing it on YouTube, if they're doing it in a more of a populist way, they're using words that people can understand. Now, I think that they really don't have a vocabulary that fits it, which in my opinion is a significant problem that evolutionary biology has. That they don't have a vocabulary to discuss the desires of evolution without calling it desire. The plan of evolution, the goal of evolution. They don't have any words for this that I've ever heard them use that aren't anthropomorphic. And the problem with it being anthropomorphic is that if you talk about evolution having a grand goal, a grand plan, a grand desire, well, then how is it not God? And that's problematic in my view. But anyways, the goal of evolution, according to evolutionary biologists, is for each organism to get its genes into the future. That's the goal. Now, that isn't the recognized goal, perhaps. That isn't the intentional goal, the conscious goal, but that is the evolutionary push. So everything has to be explained through procreation, through getting your genes into the future. That's what has to explain everything, because that is what evolution is. There can be no other goal. So the way evolutionary biologists explain fornication, adultery, promiscuity, these type of sexual behavior that especially Christianity, but many religions look down on or criminalize or call sin. The problem is that these behaviors, they explain them through the desire to procreate, to get your genes into the future. And so they have very elaborate explanations on how and why men, let's say, and as an example, I'm not saying it's only this, but men would catcall women at a job site, would be willing to put their marriage in jeopardy for a one-night stand with a woman who's very sexy. Why would men be willing to do these things? Why would they want to do these things? That's, to me, is a legitimate question. Now, the evolutionary biologist's answer for this is because we have an inherent biological evolutionary need, desire, impulse to get our genes by whatever means necessary into the future. And so that's why that many of them would not consider these behaviors to be inherently sinful. Now, they might accept them to be unethical or immoral, or to be, in a modern world view, to be unacceptable, but to call them absolutely immoral would be a very difficult claim they would make, because I suspect, and I kind of gather this from listening to many of them, that they would say that because this isn't inherently immoral in the animal world, and that human beings are merely a form of an animal, that therefore there is no inherent morality in our actual makeup, in what we are as creatures, that this is all imposed upon by society or by religion or by a collective ethos or something along those lines. Anyways, my real point, though, on this is not whether or not, what's wrong with their view. That's not really the issue. My problem is that I don't feel that Christianity, particularly, and religion on a whole, but I'm not really concerned about religion. I'm concerned with Christianity. I don't believe Christianity has done the needed work to explain things that we have preached as truths for 2,000 years. So one of the examples of this is sin. Christians have preached on sin for 2,000 years. But what is the explanation of sin? How does it work? What is its mechanism? So evolutionary biologists look at things from their worldview, and they have worked on a series of explanations on how exactly this theory of evolution explains different behaviors in humans. But I don't find that Christians have worked on the problem in that way. And I'm certainly not a scientist, and I don't pretend to be one. And I'm not pretending that I am going to do any science tomorrow, but I do have some questions. And I'm not trying to compete with evolutionary biologists or anybody for that matter. What I am trying to do is say, is there an explanation for this behavior? Now, I think the explanation in a statement is sin. Sin is the reason for this behavior. But I don't know exactly how it's the reason, and why or how it could be a better one than what evolutionary biologists are offering. So that's what we're going to talk about. One of the things we're going to talk about with Bill this tomorrow at 9 a.m. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation for anybody who is intrigued by these type of subjects the way I am. So I hope that you will tune in and see that. That'll be on the YouTube channel at 9 a.m. and that'll be broadcast live. Now, one thing that I'm going to have to start doing is recording these podcasts, because YouTube is shadow banning podcasts that mention things they don't like. If you're critical, for instance, of the government response to any type of a dilemma, any type of a public health issue, or any type of a crisis, if there's like a shooting or there's some event happens and you mention it, you comment on it in one of their videos, they will either shadow ban it, which means for the creator, such as myself, you look at your channel and it looks like the video is live and it looks like it's accessible. But anyone else who logs on to YouTube can't find it, and that's called shadow banning. They do a lot of that. Also, they just flat out nuke the streams. So like right now, I'm streaming this live. I'm not recording this on my cameras or on my computers. I'm just streaming it live and using YouTube to actually record it. I do that whether I'm going to actually be putting it public to be viewed live, or sometimes I'll just record it live to YouTube, but I will unlist it so no one can see it. And then later on in the day or the next day or whenever I'm ready to, I will make the video public where people can then see it. But I just stream these live. Because of the how busy I am at work and in the church and then all the other things I'm doing, I don't have time anymore. I tried this at the beginning to record these videos and then to edit them and then to put them up in a slicker package. And it just took way too much time. So like even with the podcast where we have multiple camera views, that's all done on the spot. That's all done live. We don't do any editing afterwards. So if I say something really stupid, which I tend to do, I know that, I'm aware of that, well then I just have to live with the consequences. I'm not going to edit it out. And likewise, if my guests say something that they wish they hadn't have said, them's are the breaks of being on live television. And in part, I like it. I like doing it live and not editing it. I think that I get better conversations with people when they're live. I know there's one side of it, which is there's a certain trepidation, fear of saying something. It's going out live. How are people going to interpret that? And so there is that. However, there's also the other side to this, and that is when you know it can be edited, it just raises that risk level up, and it makes you, I think, economize and be more careful with your words. And at the same time, it's that risk, runs the adrenaline up. It gets you more interested in what's going on. It's a more interesting format, I think. Same way with recording these at all. I mean, I know I have hardly nobody views my videos, and that's not going to change. I have no aspirations, no illusions that the internet's going to blow up with these videos and I'll be able to do this for a living. That would be great. I would sit here and make videos every day, twice a day, if I could do it and make a living at it. But nobody's going to pay me a penny to do this. I know that, and so that's fine. So why do I do this? Well, I like having these conversations. I've been having these conversations with people for a long, long time, just not recorded. I like to talk about difficult subjects. I like to talk about controversial subjects. I like to learn things from people who know something I don't know, and for them to tell me how they do it and what they do, and then to try to get on the same page and interact with them on that. I like doing that. But there is a huge advantage to doing it on camera and know that it's going to be seen by other people. So it's not enough just to film it. Everybody involved in the conversation has to know that it's going to be filmed. And it's like the difference between taking $10,000 of your own money and going and playing Texas Hold'em poker, no limit poker, or taking $10,000 of somebody else's money and going and playing poker. If you have a bunch of people sitting around playing poker with other people's money, that game is not very interesting. You're just going all in all the time, because if you lose, you didn't lose anything. And it's kind of like that. So when we have these conversations and they're recorded and they're live and they're broadcast and they're basically memorialized for all eternity practically on the internet, or until YouTube doesn't like them, well then that raises the stakes and everybody is taking it more seriously. And so you get a lot better conversation, in my opinion, having it this way. So even if I have very few viewers, which I realize that's the case, I would still do this way because I feel I get better conversations. And I just really enjoy doing this podcast myself. I like talking through things. Because that's how I think, that's how I believe that we think as human beings, both through writing and through speaking, is actually thinking. And we've talked about this before, but this is why this is why those of you that are Christians, well, I guess all of you, but those of you that are Christians need to have a charitable amount of tolerance for your teachers, preachers, and pastors when they're speaking from the pulpit. Now, there is a way to preach a sermon where you're not thinking out loud, and that is to write the sermon out and then either memorize it and repeat it or read it, right? And there are many, many pastors and preachers who do that, especially in the larger churches, where they don't feel they can afford to be out there speaking extemporaneously, winging it. And they're probably right. However, if your pastor, your preacher, your teachers, if they basically make a few notes, maybe make extensive notes, but they're really notes of points they want to touch on, verses they want to read and expound on, and maybe illustrations that they plan on using, but they're really not writing out a speech at all. They just have notes, like it's kind of like a Google map. They have a rough drawing or outline of what they want to get to in the sermon. But for the most part, they're up there speaking completely extemporaneously as to what they're actually saying. And it's easy to become overly critical with them because you say, well, they didn't say that just right, and they lost their train of thought, and they chased a rabbit, and they said something really stupid. I'm not excusing it, and I believe that every preacher should take responsibility for their mistakes. But as a listener, as someone who listens to sermons, I need to realize that I'm required to make a certain charitable allowance, to have a certain amount of charitable tolerance to the preachers and teachers and pastors who are speaking extemporaneously, because I need to realize that what they are actually doing up there at the pulpit is not lecturing in the academic sense. They are pondering. They are thinking out loud. Now, you can say that you don't like that and you'd rather them not do that, and that's fair. There's many times I don't think pastors actually ought to be doing that. I think there's a lot of times when pastors ought to have things well, either completely written down or planned out very, very carefully and closely. There's some events that, in my opinion, it is disrespectful to the moment itself, to the people involved, to be up there speaking extemporaneously because it's too susceptible to saying things you shouldn't say. A wedding, I think, probably would fall in that category, especially if the bride and groom have spent a lot of money on it. It's obvious they want a formal wedding. They don't want somebody up there saying things they shouldn't be saying. I remember a long time ago, I was asked to preach in a wedding, and I'm not asked to preach in weddings much anymore because, well, I'm not good at that. So if you were maybe out there, you're thinking, man, maybe we have Mike preach in our wedding. That's probably not a good idea. Mike's not good at that. Mike Pemberton's good at that. I've heard other people that are really good at that. I'm not really good at that. It's just, I'm not into ceremony. I'm not into pomp. I just don't like those things. And so I tend to not, I'm just not very good at them. Anyways, I was preaching in this wedding and I went off on a rant about homosexuality. My wife was real upset at me. See, and that's because I was up there speaking from off the cuff. I was just talking off the top of your head, extemporaneously. And there's events, there's times, there's places where you just shouldn't be doing that. There's other times I think you get a more dynamic message. Now, one of the advantages of speaking extemporaneously is that if you can tap into the audience, right? If you can connect with the audience and you can perceive their reaction to what is being said, and you can feed off of that, and you can and what you end up having is a conversation with the audience. That doesn't mean they're speaking. Now, I know there's some places where you're actually having a literal conversation with the audience, right? You're speaking and they're speaking back to you, and you're basically conversing. Now, there's good and bad to that. The good would be kind of like a open format Sunday school, like I like to do, where anyone can comment and ask questions, and we can have that conversation. And that's good. But if you have a sermon and you're trying to preach a sermon, that type of interaction usually is counterproductive to what you're trying to do. And so you would typically want to steer clear of that in those scenarios. However, you don't have to have that conversation. A good preacher is watching the eyes mainly. I mean, you really got to look at people's eyes when you're speaking. If you're going to be a public speaker, you have to learn to quit looking at their foreheads and looking at their chins, because that's what people want to do. They want to avoid the eyes. And so they look towards people, but they look through them, they look past them, they look over them or below them, they look around them, but you never are actually looking at the crowd, each one individually. And it's very important to do that as a public speaker. And that's because you are watching their reaction to what you're saying. And that is a form of conversation. So in their eyes, they are registering doubt, agreement, confusion, excitement, boredom. These are all very important words they are shouting at you with their facial expressions, their eyes particularly, and even their body language. And while you can't interact with every single individual in an auditorium, there's some people that are going to be bored and there's nothing you can do about it. There's some people that are going to be confused and there's just no way you're ever going to be able to explain it well enough at that moment to satisfy them. And there's some people that are angry that you're never going to win over, but you can win a lot of the angry people over. You can clarify a lot of things for the confused people. You can wake out of boredom a lot of the bored people if you're conversing with them through this very interesting means that we have of doing this, which is one person listening with their mouth and the auditorium speaking with their ears and their eyes. You like how I did that? Switch that around there? I did that little switch over. Anyway, so when your pastor, your teacher, your preachers are up there, you have to understand that they are having a conversation with you, and to a large degree, they're thinking out loud on these matters, and so they may say things that they don't actually really think, that they don't actually really believe themselves. It isn't that they're saying it cynically. It's that they're thinking out loud and they say it and they'll think about it later and go, yeah, that probably didn't make sense. That probably isn't accurate. That's probably not what I was trying to say. And you have to make allowances for people to be able to speak that way. Anyway, so let's move on to a little bit of housekeeping. The podcast I had with Brett dealt with science. So if you haven't seen the podcast, you can go back. It was the last one we did. It was the one we did last week with Brett Carpenter in Indiana. And we dealt a lot with science and a lot with some with evolution, but mainly they deal with science. So I have a contention that I have been making in the podcast, and there's a reason Brett wanted to come on the podcast and talk to me, because he doesn't agree with this assessment or this statement that I make or have made on the podcast in the past. And I continue to be until now, I'm pretty convinced that I'm right on this. Now, I'm open for anybody to come on the podcast and explain to me and to my audience, both of them, how I'm wrong. And I could be wrong. I'm not dead set on this. So if someone can come on and explain this to me and show me where I'm wrong on this issue, I'll be happy to go on and say, hey, I was wrong. I thought that's the way it was, but I'm mistaken. But I don't think I'm wrong on this. But Brett thinks I'm wrong, so he wanted to talk about it. And so in case you've missed all of this and maybe you're not sure what I'm talking about, so what I'm talking about is that I made a statement in a few weeks ago, I forget when it was, that creationism, or creation, I should say, is not science. It's not science, and therefore should not be taught in science class. Now, this has been, both by Brett and by others, misconstrued, misrepresented what I said. And I'm not blaming anyone, and I'm not trying to throw Brett or anyone else under the bus or criticize them. I understand why they hear it the way they hear it, but I'm very careful how I say this. And that is, I didn't say that creation shouldn't be taught in school. I said it shouldn't be taught in a science class because it's not science. Now, Brett's contention is that evolution isn't science. But evolution is science. I just think it's bad science. Okay, evolution is science. I think it's bad science. So it's not that I think evolution's good and that's what should be taught. I'm just saying, regardless of whether evolution is good or bad, right or wrong, should or should not be taught is really beside the point. It's not about, well, if evolution's taught and that's not science, then creation should be taught, even though it may not be science. That is, to me, a false dichotomy or a false parallel. Whether or not evolution should or should not be taught is not my point. It's not what I'm commenting to. What I'm saying is that creation is not science. And what I want to see taught to my kids in science class is science. Now, this, I realize, is controversial. And I realize that many of you and many people hearing this, especially Christians, are going to be very upset and not like that. And I understand. I understand what you're saying. However, you need to take a moment, or I would recommend you take a moment and think what my argument about this actually is. So my argument is this: science, and this is how I define science, not the word science, the concept. Okay? I'm not defining the word. I'm not telling you what the dictionary definition is of the word of science. I'm just telling you what science as a concept is in my mind, how I see science. Now, Brett didn't really like this definition either, but he couldn't tell me what was wrong with it. So if you think there's something wrong with how I'm defining or understanding what science is, then I would love to hear that from you also. Now, I did have one comment on my YouTube video that sent me the dictionary definition of the word science, which is like, well, whatever. I mean, I'm not even sure what that's supposed to mean, but whatever. Okay, fine. But if you have some way of telling me what is actually wrong with how I'm defining science, then I would like to hear that. But this is how I would define science. So science is the natural explanation for natural occurrences. That's how I would define science. Now, I realize that scientific method is much more than that. Scientific process is more than that. The word science can be used in many different ways. This is why I'm not talking about the word science. I am talking about the idea of science in the context where we would put evolution, creation, science class, school, a school curriculum, okay? In that context, what is science? Because not everything is science. Not everything belongs in science. If everything is science, then why would we have any other subject in a school class? Whether it be primary, secondary, high school, or whether it be higher education, we have all different types of classes. And we have science classes. And it's because not everything is science. There's even debate amongst academics of whether or not math is science. Which is interesting because in a way, math is the language of science, but is it science itself? There's a lot of debate amongst academics whether or not that's the case. But I argue, whether you agree with me or not, I don't know, but this is my argument. Science is the natural explanation or the looking for natural explanations for natural occurrences. So it's the quest for natural explanations for natural occurrences. That makes creation not science. Because creation, and I'm not saying creation didn't happen. See, this is how people hear that, and I want to get to that in a minute. But I'm not saying that creation didn't happen. What I'm saying is, would you rather me slow down, Alejandro? I'm sorry. What I'm saying about, I'm sorry, those that don't know, maybe you're listening to this, I'm speaking to people that are on the YouTube channel, on the live chat. You can interact with me on these videos if you go on the live chat. So I'll respond to people on the live chat every now and then. So if you're listening to the podcast on audio, that might have thrown you off. Sorry about that. Anyway, what I'm saying about this is that science is the quest for natural explanations to natural occurrences, where creation is a supernatural explanation for a natural occurrence. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. That doesn't mean that I personally don't believe that there is a supernatural explanation for a natural occurrence. I personally do believe in creation. It's just not science. It's something else. It's theology, maybe. And that's what I think it is. But even if it's not that doesn't really matter. It's not science. It cannot be naturally investigated. It can't be naturally explained. It's not a natural cause for a natural occurrence. Now, that is, you know, you may not agree with that. And that's okay. But let me explain why I think it's important to make this distinction. It's not really about creation and evolution. It is about a lot more than that. What I think much more important than that, it's about a couple of different things that I'm going to try to remember what those are and go through them. So the first thing is that just because there is a natural explanation for some natural occurrence doesn't mean that there isn't also additionally another explanation that is not natural. And having a supernatural explanation for something does not preclude a parallel or additional natural explanation for it. Here's an example. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes and tells them, the Corinthian church, that because they were doing the Lord's Supper wrong, doing it unworthily is how he puts it, that many of them were sick and some were even dead. Now, do you think that illness and that death that he says they were suffering because of the way they were doing the Lord's Supper, do you believe that was a natural illness? That if they would have gone to a medical professional, maybe not one in their day, but how about in our day? What if they went into a state-of-the-art medical facility and they gave them CAT scans and MRIs and blood work and did all the things that a medical professional would do? Could that doctor find a natural cause for that illness? I would say absolutely. Now, you could say, well, I had a doctor who I went to and I was sick and they couldn't find. I'm speaking theoretically, okay? We are speaking in the abstract, the hypothetical. And in the hypothetical world, in the ideal world, you could go to a doctor, one of these Corinthians could be taken to a doctor, and the doctor could diagnose the natural cause of their illness, whatever that was. But Paul said that the reason they were sick was because of a supernatural cause. They were sick because they were being judged by God for doing the Lord's Supper unworthily. Now, if you go to the doctor and you're sick, and you go to the doctor, do you want the doctor to tell you, well, I think that this has happened because you took the Lord's Supper unworthily? Is that the diagnosis you will accept? Are you going to ask for a second opinion? What if the second doctor says the same thing? I think you're sick because you took the Lord's Supper unworthily. Now, that might be absolutely true. You might be sick because you took the Lord's Supper unworthily. But that's not a medical explanation. It doesn't matter that it's true. It's not a medical explanation. That is a theological explanation. Let me give you another example of this. When Noah comes out of the ark, God makes a covenant with him to no longer destroy the earth with water. And he says that a token of that covenant, he's going to put his bow, the rainbow, in the sky. Is that the scientific explanation of the rainbow? Or is that the theological meaning of the rainbow? Science cannot discover that theological meaning, but it can tell you, science can tell you exactly how that rainbow works. Now, theology cannot tell you how that rainbow works or where it came from. Not the actual rainbow in its natural sense, but it can tell you what that rainbow means from a theological perspective, which science cannot tell you. So science can tell you the facts about something, perhaps, not always. Science knows very little actual in relationship to what there is to know, right? So science knows more and more every day exponentially, and yet it still knows very, very little in relationship to all there is to be known. So science can tell you the facts, in so much as it has them, of the things. But theology can tell you the value of those things. And it's critical that Christians maintain a separation between science and the facts it can give you, and faith and the values that it prescribes to you. These are separate things. And when Christians, and this gets my second issue about this, so when Christians get upset because somebody says creation isn't science, I know they think they're defending God and they're defending faith and they're defending the seriousness of the Bible and how it should be taken seriously, but you're actually doing the opposite. It's actually counterproductive. This is why. Let me explain this to you. If you're not understanding, maybe you're way up there and you understand. But if you don't understand what I'm saying, let me try to explain why this is counterproductive. So evolutionary biologists and types like that, people that mainly atheists who believe that science is the only value system or it's the only knowledge system. It's the only thing that can lead us to truth is science. Most of them think this way, or a variation of that way. All right, so These people, they believe science. If it's not science, let me put it this way. If it's not science, according to them, it's not true. It's fable. It's make believe. Okay? So when you say that creation must be science, has to be science, you are agreeing that science is the end all be all, that it is the maximum, and therefore anything that is to be true must be scientifically true. Otherwise, it's tantamount to being false. You see what I'm saying? So when we do that, we are agreeing with them. I am telling you, I do not agree with this statement. Science is not the end-all, be-all. I believe science is an extraordinarily limited perspective, an extraordinarily narrow or diminutive, small tool. It's a very useful tool, but it's a very limited tool. It's not something that is going to help us in understanding human interaction. It is not going to help us understand eternity. It's not going to help us understand God or the spiritual dimension. It cannot. Science has no way of peering past the natural. Maybe they will eventually be able to look all the way back to the beginning of time, which would be amazing. I hope they do. But that's as far as they can go. Now, as a Christian, I believe that when you reach the beginning of time, that is the threshold of creation. That's where God supernaturally brought everything into existence. Science cannot speak to that. That doesn't make it less true. That makes science more limited. But when you try to argue that creation must be science, you are by default upholding the atheistic idolatry of science. Now, I reject that idolatry. I do not idolize science. When I say that creation isn't science, that is not to bring creation down. Quite the opposite, my belligerent friend. It is to elevate creation to a transcendental level. Because science is so limited. Science cannot speak of these things. Science can tell you that the Corinthian is sick from malaria. But he cannot tell you that baked into the entire cosmic, how would I put it? The entire cosmic play is God's providential cursing of this person in eternity. In other words, outside of time. A lot of times we want to think that God did things long ago, but God didn't ever live long ago. God is not past or future. God is eternal. He's outside of time. That means everything God does happens outside, or at least its causation is outside of time. That's why it says that Jesus Christ suffered before the world began. We use the word before. It's not technically accurate, but we don't have a way of conceptualizing the interaction of eternity and time. But God dwells in eternity. And if God in eternity does something, if in eternity he answers prayer, or if in eternity he judges somebody's sin and strikes them with illness or death, that happens outside of time, its cause, and it is integrated into time, baked in. It isn't that God is determined in the sense that you have no choice and that you have no free will, and that because he has judged this to be the case in eternity, therefore you must do it, and you're this mindless robot. It's not how it works. It's that God, living past, present, and future in eternity, acts from eternity into time, all baked in. Now, science can't speak to that because science can't speak to eternity. They just can't. They can barely conceptualize time, much less eternity. But theology has no problem with these matters. Theology far exceeds science in its reach and in its grasp by far. So why are we so worried about whether or not theological statements like God created all things are scientifically provable? It just doesn't matter. And if you're a scientist, you shouldn't be worried about trying to prove creation. You can't prove creation. Now, that doesn't mean that evolution is therefore by default true. Doesn't mean that at all. But could there be a natural explanation for the existence of things? That does not diminish the supernatural explanation. Just like the natural explanation of a rainbow does not diminish the supernatural explanation of the rainbow. Are you telling me that because you understand the prismatic effect of light traversing water droplets, that all of a sudden now the rainbow doesn't mean what you thought it meant? Or can you understand the prism effect of rainbows and at the same time have the exact same faith or greater in what God said the rainbow was and meant? Can you, if we were to find, let's say hypothetically, one of these Corinthian Christians who had died from taking the Lord's Supper unworthily, and we were able to do some DNA test out of the deep tissue in the marrow of their bone or something, and somehow with some technology that yet doesn't exist, you're able to determine this is one of those Corinthians, and he died from malaria. Would that somehow ruin your faith in the Bible? What, you thought he had a supernatural disease? Well, then how did it kill them naturally? How can a supernatural disease that no doctor could diagnose kill somebody naturally? So knowing those things isn't going to destroy your faith, but why? That's the question. Why would it not destroy your faith? Well, it's because you understand that science does not speak to theology or anything else for that matter. This is why science is so limited. It's why it's so narrow. And it's why it's such a huge, huge mistake. I'm channeling Trump. Huge, huge mistake. It's why it's such a huge mistake. I know I do a terrible Trump impersonation. It's such a huge mistake for Christians, even though they're not trying to do this, to unintentionally idolize science by lifting it up, elevating it to say, if something is not scientific, then it is false. So, for instance, you say, well, Brett asked me, is evolution science? Yes. Yes, it's science. He says, no, it's not science because it goes against laws of nature, because it's been proven false every time, because I'm not saying all those things are not true. But science is not truth. This is the mistake. And for Christians to say science is truth is to over-elevate science. Beside the point that means there is no science. Because even things that we have thought were absolutely true have turned out to be wrong over time. Science basically knows nothing to be true. The way scientists often will put this on a scale, the scale goes from 0 to 1. 0 being absolutely false, and 1 being absolutely true. In other words, the probability is 100% to 0%. Now, you ask any scientist, tell me one thing that has a 0% possibility of being true. There is no such thing. Everything is somehow possible. There is no 0 when you are running possibility numbers. You'll never run the numbers of the possibility. If you say, what's the possibility of me dropping a marble and it not hitting the table? Well, it's not 0. It's never 0. It might be infinitesimally small, but it's never 0. And it's never 1. In other words, it's never 100% either. So they don't know. Science cannot tell you anything. Absolutely. There is no for sure with science. So we should not, we cannot, we must not elevate science to that level. That is reserved for theology. That is reserved for even other disciplines, but especially theology. All right. So that's my point I'm making. And I realize that may not be a point that you're that concerned with. I am concerned with it for a couple of reasons. One is because I don't think Christians are engaging themselves sufficiently in scientific endeavor. I think we need more scientific Christians, Christians who are scientists, in the realm or in the vein of, say, James Tour or John Lennox. These are people who are scientists and Christians. I would strongly, like I told Brett, I would strongly encourage any of you to read John Lennox's book, 7 Days That Divide the World, in which he deals with this subject, although a little differently, not exactly from the same angle I'm talking about, but very similar, and very well. So John Lennox is a scientist, and he's a very prominent Christian apologist at the same time. And his science work is in mathematics at Oxford University. So he is a very qualified, recognized scientist who also is a very outspoken Christian. And so I'd encourage you to read that, and you can look at John Lennox, look at James Tour. These are the kind of scientists that we need Christians to aspire to be. Not all Christians are going to be scientists, I understand. Not all Christians are going to be plumbers. Not all Christians are going to be, doctors. But Christianity cannot relinquish the field or any field. It's almost as if for Christians now, being a scientist is taboo for many. Because many Christians feel that to seek for a natural explanation for things like origin of life, to seek for a natural explanation for the existence of the species, that is to doubt the Bible. But that's not what that is. These would be the same Christians that would say that we shouldn't try to figure out what makes a rainbow. These would be the same Christians who do not like and were very much against the space program, especially going to the moon, because they quote verses like that they were exalted to the heavens, they're going to be brought low, saying that God would not have men in space. We do not need that in Christianity. We need to understand that there might very well be a viable, natural explanation for where things come from, that science can reveal, that would be helpful to know. And in no way does knowing that natural means, that natural process by which things might have come into existence, does that diminish from the fact that God created all things. It just doesn't diminish from that. Now, I know some of you can't see that. You see that to provide or to propose any natural process by which things came into existence is to diminish the theological explanations of Genesis. But we will have to leave it there. I'm out of time. But I hope that I clarified my position on some things and gave you something to think about and chew over and think about. And look, if you have any comments or questions, you can email me at podcast@freebornchurch.com. You can post comments on the comment section, not the live chat, but on the comment section of the YouTube videos. I generally don't respond in YouTube videos or on the comment section, but you could do that if you want. But the best way, if you want to contact me, is to contact me through the podcast@freebornchurch.com, through email. That's the best way to contact me if you want a response. If you want to just tell me off and tell me how stupid I am, then you're going to have to get in line. I ought to make a little app where you can sign up and get in line to tell me how stupid I am, because there's a long line of people doing that. All right. Tomorrow, Saturday, 9 a.m., which will be the 23rd, if you don't know when this is, 23rd of May, Saturday, 9 a.m., Bill Kincaid is going to be on the podcast. We're going to be talking about a number of different subjects, and I'm very, very interested. I'm very excited about this. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. I also have a number of other podcasts lined up, different guests coming on over the next few weeks, so don't miss it. It's every Saturday at 9 a.m. Okay, I guess that's all. I thank you for being with us. This is the Freeborn Podcast. My name is Mike Jackson, in case you don't know. I'm the host of the Freeborn Podcast. I guess I'm also the producer and the editor, and I guess I do a lot of. I'm the only one here, so I guess I'm everything today. So, anyways, thank you for being with us, and I will talk to you tomorrow.